What is a horse worth? What is the price of a single animal standing in a dusty paddock under the vast Montana sky? For John Callahan, that question arrived in a storm of dust and noise, delivered by a machine that didn't belong. The sleek black helicopter descended like a dragonfly of prey, its blades whipping the dry grass into a frenzy. It settled in the west pasture, a place usually reserved for grazing cattle and the quiet passage of time. John, standing on his porch, didn't flinch. At 62, his face was a roadmap of seasons, of droughts and hard winters. His hands, resting on the worn porch rail, were gnarled and strong, hands that had built fences, delivered calves, and held on tight when everything else was letting go. He watched as a man in a suit, looking impossibly clean for this part of the world, ducked under the slowing blades and walked towards him. The man's shoes were worth more than John's truck. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of absolute certainty. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his smile polished and sharp. "Mr. John Callahan?" he asked, his voice smooth. John just nodded, his gaze unwavering. The man's eyes flickered past John towards the paddock where a single horse stood, watching them. The horse was a deep, shimmering gold, a palomino so perfect it seemed to drink the sunlight. "My name is Javier Morales. I represent an international consortium of buyers. I've flown a long way to see your horse." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "The one you call Miracle." John remained silent. He'd been getting calls for months ever since a local reporter did a small piece on the horse. The calls started small, local breeders. Then they grew, trainers from Kentucky, owners from Florida. Now, a helicopter. Javier opened his briefcase. "My clients are prepared to make you a significant offer, Mr. Callahan. We are authorized to start at $2 million. The wind carried the number across the porch. It was a figure so large it felt like a joke. Enough to pay off the bank, fix the roof, replace the ancient tractor, and live without the gnawing worry that had been John's constant companion for a decade. John's gaze shifted to Miracle. The horse tossed his head, a ripple of muscle and light. He saw not a $2 million asset, but a promise he'd made to himself in the dark, with the rain lashing against the windows. He looked back at the slick agent. "He's not for sale." Javier's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of surprise crossed his eyes. "Mr. Callahan, perhaps you misunderstood. That is the starting offer. The final number can be substantially higher." John just shook his head slowly. "The horse is not for sale. To understand why a man drowning in debt would turn down a lifeline, you have to go back. You have to go back 2 years, to the night Miracle was born. A night when he wasn't a miracle at all. He was a death sentence. The night was a maelstrom. A late spring storm hammered the Gallatin Valley, turning the ranch into a sea of mud and roaring wind. Inside the birthing stall, the air was thick with tension and the scent of hay and fear. John's prize mare, a gentle giant named Starlight, was in labor, and it was going wrong. Hours had passed. John, soaked from a dozen trips outside, worked with a grim focus, his movements sure and practiced, but his heart was sinking. When the foal finally arrived, it was in a rush of fluid and exhaustion, and the sight of it stole the breath from his lungs. It was a colt, but he was terrifyingly still. His small body was limp, his legs splayed at unnatural angles. He didn't gasp for air. He didn't move. John's hands, so strong and steady, trembled as he cleared the foal's airways. Nothing. He rubbed the small body with a rough towel, trying to stimulate a breath, a twitch, anything. A weak, shuddering gasp was the only response. The foal's eyes were open, but they were a milky, unfocused blue, a gaze that saw nothing. He called the vet. Dr. Evelyn Reed arrived in a mud-splattered truck, her face etched with a familiar weariness. She was a good vet, practical and sharp, but John saw the look in her eyes as she knelt by the foal, and he knew. "He's a dummy foal, John," she said softly, her voice competing with the drumming rain on the barn roof. "Severe oxygen deprivation during the birth, neonatal maladjustment syndrome. His brain didn't get the signal to wake up." She ran a light over his eyes. No response. "He can't stand. He has no suckle reflex. His organs are shutting down. She straightened up, placing a hand on John's shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but her words were steel. I know this is hard. I know how much you loved Starlight. But he's suffering. The most humane thing to do is to let him go. John looked down at the tiny, broken creature. Every instinct, every year of his life as a rancher told him she was right. It was the logical, practical choice. It was the merciful choice. But as he looked, he saw a tiny flicker, a twitch of an ear, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse beating in the fragile neck. It wasn't logic. It was a whisper, a feeling. He looked at Evelyn, his jaw set. No, not yet. Evelyn sighed, a sound of resignation, not judgment. John, his chances are less than 1 in 100. The cost for round-the-clock care, for the meds, it will be thousands. And for what? To prolong his suffering for a few more days? Just then, the headlights of another truck cut through the rain. It was Marcus Thorne, his neighbor from the sprawling ranch to the east. Thorne Equine Enterprises wasn't a ranch. It was a corporation with fences. Marcus stepped out, his expensive boots somehow avoiding the worst of the mud. He peered into the stall, his face a mask of detached curiosity. Heard you were having trouble, John? He glanced at the foal, then at the vet, and gave a short, cynical laugh. Looks like you lost this lottery ticket. Don't throw good money after bad. Listen to the doc. Sometimes you just have to cut your losses. Marcus's words were meant to sound like practical advice, the kind one businessman gives another. But to John, they felt like a shovel hitting loose dirt on a coffin. Marcus Thorne represented everything John was not. His ranch was a pristine, multi-million-dollar operation with automated feeders and wealthy clients from back east. John's place, Callahan Creek Ranch, had been in his family for 100 years, but it was bleeding money, held together by grit and baling wire. Thorne had been circling for years, making casual offers for parcels of John's land, talking about efficiency and consolidation. He saw John's ranch not as a legacy, but as a poorly performing asset. It's a business, John, not a petting zoo, Thorne said, wiping a stray drop of rain from his clean jacket. Put it out of its misery. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Dr. Reed looked at John, her expression softening. He's not wrong about the business part, John. You can't afford this fight. John looked from Thorne's polished, dismissive face to the vet's compassionate but weary one. Then he looked down at the foal, whose life was being debated like a line item on a budget. The tiny creature let out a weak, sighing breath. That was it. That was the decision. Without a word, John bent down. He gently gathered the foal, all awkward legs and fragile bones, into his arms. The foal weighed almost nothing. John wrapped him in an old horse blanket, cradling him against his chest. He stood up and faced them, the tiny, doomed life held tight in his arms. He walked right past Marcus Thorne, out of the barn, and into the raging storm, heading for the one place he knew he could control. His house. The first 24 hours were a blur of desperation. John turned his small laundry room into a makeshift ICU. He laid the foal on a bed of old blankets next to the warmth of the humming dryer. The vet had left him with a feeding tube, syringes, and a box of medications, along with a bill that made his stomach clench. If he makes it through the night, call me, she'd said, the if hanging heavy in the air. Every 2 hours, the alarm on his old clock radio would buzz. John would stumble out of his armchair, his back aching, and begin the ritual. He'd mix the full replacement formula, carefully measure the nutrients, and fill the syringe. The feeding tube was a nightmare, a tiny plastic hose he had to gently guide down the foal's throat. The first few times, the foal gagged, his little body convulsing weakly. John's hands, usually so steady with a branding iron or a set of reins, shook. He whispered to the foal, the same way he used to whisper to his daughter when she was a baby with a fever. Come on now, son, just a little bit. That's it, for me. He massaged the foal's legs, trying to work life back into the limp limbs. He checked his temperature. He cleaned him. Between feedings, he'd sit in the armchair, watching the foal's shallow breathing, listening to the rain and the silence of his empty house. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, In those quiet, desperate hours, the voices of reason echoed in his head. Dr. Reed's pragmatism, Marcus Thorne's cold logic. They were right. This was insane. He was pouring money he didn't have into a hopeless cause. He was neglecting the rest of the ranch. The fences needed mending, the other horses needed attention. But then he would look at the foal, and the world would shrink to that one small, warm room. He wasn't just fighting for the foal. He was fighting against the idea that everything had a price tag. He was fighting against the notion that if something is broken, you throw it away. He was fighting for the memory of his wife, who had always believed in second chances. On the third day, something changed. As John was preparing the feeding tube, the foal's head moved, a tiny, weak turn of his neck. His eyes, still cloudy, seemed to follow the movement of John's hand. John's heart hammered against his ribs. Later that day, as he held the bottle near the foal's mouth out of sheer habit, a flicker of instinct fired in the foal's damaged brain. A weak, clumsy tongue emerged and tried to suckle. It was a feeble attempt, but it was a choice. The foal was choosing to live. John sank to his knees, the bottle clattering to the floor. He just watched, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He had a name for him now. Miracle. The weeks that followed were a slow, painstaking climb out of the dark. Miracle's recovery wasn't a sudden cinematic moment. It was a series of tiny, hard-won victories. The first time he stood on his own, his legs wobbled like stilts, and he collapsed after a few seconds, but he had stood. John had cheered, his voice hoarse, as if his team had just won the Super Bowl. The first time he took a wobbly step, following John out of the laundry room and into the kitchen, his little hooves clicking on the linoleum, was a parade. John spent hours with him, using a technique he'd read about in an old veterinary journal. A gentle squeeze using a soft rope around the foal's torso, meant to mimic the pressure of the birth canal and trigger the neurological on switch. Dr. Reed had called it folk medicine, but she didn't argue when she came for a checkup and saw Miracle tracking her with his eyes, his gaze now clear and intelligent. She checked his vitals, a small, amazed smile playing on her lips. "I've been a vet for 15 years, John," she said, shaking her head. "I have never seen this. Never." The vet bills piled up on the kitchen table, a white mountain of debt. John sold off a few head of cattle he'd been planning to keep, a painful decision that felt like selling off the furniture to pay for heat. Marcus Thorne would drive by, slowing his pristine truck to stare at John in the paddock, exercising the colt on a lead line. Thorne's expression was no longer one of simple mockery. It was laced with something else. Disbelief. Annoyance. As Miracle grew, he shed the last vestiges of his initial weakness. His legs strengthened. His coordination became flawless. But there was something more. It wasn't just that he was healthy. He was extraordinary. His coat, a common palomino at first, deepened into a rare, burnished gold that seemed to shift and shimmer in the sun. His movements were different. Other horses ran. Miracle flowed. There was an economy of motion, a liquid power that was breathtaking to watch. He moved with the grace of a dancer and the speed of a striking snake. John, who had seen thousands of horses in his life, had never seen anything like it. He was not just a survivor. He was a prodigy. The whispers started at the local feed store, then at the county fair. People would pull over on the road next to John's property just to watch Miracle run in the pasture. The small-time reporter came, and the story went online. Then the phone started ringing. A year passed. Miracle was no longer a fragile colt, but a stunning yearling. A picture of vibrant health and raw potential. The laundry room was a distant memory. He now stood taller and prouder than any other horse his age. His intelligence was as striking as his beauty. He learned commands with startling speed, anticipating John's intentions with an almost telepathic connection. Marcus Thorne saw it all. The envy that had been planted on that rainy night had grown into a thorny obsession. He saw the crowds gathering by the road. He heard the talk. He saw the horse that he had dismissed as worthless becoming a local legend. And he wanted it. One afternoon, Thorne's truck pulled into John's driveway. He got out. His demeanor changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by a forced, business-like friendliness. "John," he began, "I'll admit it. I was wrong about the colt. He's turned into a fine-looking animal. A very fine-looking animal. He walked over to the fence, watching Miracle graze. I'll give you $50,000 for him. Right now. Cash. $50,000 was a fortune to John. It would have solved so many problems. But he just shook his head. He's not for sale, Marcus. Thorne's jaw tightened. Don't be a fool. That's more than fair for a yearling with no papers and no bloodline to speak of. It's a sentimental price. Maybe, John said, his voice quiet. But he's not for sale. Thorne stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. He got back in his truck, but before he drove off, he leaned out the window. Every man has his price, John, and everything you own has a loan attached to it. Remember that. The threat was no longer veiled. A few weeks later, John received a letter. It was from the bank, a formal, impersonal notice that his agricultural loan, the one that kept the ranch afloat, had been reviewed. Due to market volatility and risk assessment, the terms were being changed. The payment schedule was being accelerated. John knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this wasn't the bank. This was Marcus Thorne. He had made good on his threat. The pressure was mounting, a slow, crushing weight. The phone calls from trainers and buyers were becoming more frequent, the numbers they mentioned more absurd. John felt like he was being pulled in two. On one side was the legacy of his family, the land that held their sweat and history. On the other was a golden horse that represented a promise, a defiance of the cold logic that said everything, and everyone, was replaceable. And now, the past 2 years had led to this moment. The helicopter in his pasture, the man with the briefcase, and a number that could either save him or cost him his soul. We are back in the present. Javier Morales stood on the porch, his patience beginning to fray. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, painting the scene in hues of orange and deep purple. Miracle stood by the fence watching John, his ears perked. Mr. Callahan, Javier said, his voice taking on a harder edge. I am not a man who enjoys haggling. My clients are the most serious buyers in the world. This is not a game. Let's be clear. He took a step closer. We know about your financial situation. We know about the notices from the bank. We know about your neighbor, Mr. Thorne. John's face remained a stony mask, but inside, a cold dread spread through him. They had done their homework. This wasn't just about buying a horse. It was a strategic acquisition. We are prepared to offer you $7 million, Javier said, the words dropping like stones into a silent pond. 7 million. That is our final offer. It pays off this entire ranch. It buys you a new truck, a new tractor, and a life of comfort. You never have to worry about a bank notice or a greedy neighbor again. All you have to do is say yes. $7 million. The number was abstract, unreal. It was salvation. It was the end of the struggle. John looked at his home, the paint peeling on the siding, the porch step that sagged. He looked out at the land, every acre of which held a memory. His father teaching him to ride. His wife planting the lilac bush by the fence. This offer wasn't just money, it was a way to preserve all of that. He could keep the land. He could finally rest. All it would cost him was Miracle. He looked at the horse, who nickered softly, as if sensing the turmoil in his human. He saw the operating table, the vet's grim face, the tiny broken body. He saw the first flicker of life, the first wobbly step. This was more than a horse. It was a testament. It was his defiance made real. What was the price of a soul? John took a deep breath, the dry Montana air filling his lungs. He opened his mouth to give Javier his final answer, the words already forming on his tongue. But before he could speak, another sound cut through the evening air, the rumble of a heavy-duty truck engine coming in fast. A cloud of dust billowed at the end of his driveway. It was Marcus Thorne's truck. But he wasn't alone. A Gallatin County Sheriff's car pulled in right behind him. Thorne stepped out, his face a triumphant sneer. He wasn't holding a checkbook. He was holding a sheaf of official-looking papers. The sheriff, a man John had known for 20 years, got out of his car, his expression grim. He wouldn't meet John's eyes. Thorne strode past the multimillionaire agent as if he were invisible and stopped at the bottom of the steps, holding up the papers for John to see. "It's over, John," Thorne said, his voice dripping with victory. "Foreclosure notice. The bank's patience has run out, which is to say my patience has run out. You have 24 hours to pay the loan in full. If you don't, at sunset tomorrow the sheriff here will escort you off this property, and everything on it, the house, the land, all the livestock, becomes the property of Thorne Equine Enterprises. Including," he added, gesturing with the papers towards the paddock, "your miracle." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The smug face of Marcus Thorne, the cold paper of the foreclosure notice, the setting sun painting the sky in blood-red strokes. John felt the porch rail press into his back, the only thing holding him upright. The $7 million Javier Morales had offered moments before was now just phantom money, an echo of a choice that no longer existed. The sheriff, a man named Bill, shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "John, my hands are tied," Bill said, his voice low and apologetic. "The judge signed it this morning. Thorne bought your debt from the bank. It's legal." Thorne smirked, savoring the moment. Legal and smart. It's just business. Javier Morales, however, did not look defeated. He looked intrigued. The deal hadn't died. It had just become more interesting. He stepped forward, placing himself between John and Thorne. "An interesting development," Javier said, his voice smooth as silk. "Mr. Thorne, you have just acquired a property, but you do not yet own the asset I came here for. The horse is still Mr. Callahan's until sunset tomorrow." Thorne laughed. "A technicality. What's he going to do? Ride off into the sunset? In 24 hours the horse is mine. And then, Mr. Morales, my price will be $10 million. Javier smiled a predator's smile. "Perhaps we can make tomorrow a little more decisive." He turned to John, his eyes sharp and assessing. The despair in John's face was being replaced by a slow burning anger. Javier saw his opening. "Mr. Callahan, your neighbor seems to believe his victory is assured because he plays with a stacked deck. Let's offer him a game he can't rig." Thorne and the sheriff left in clouds of dust and superiority. Javier Morales did not. His helicopter remained a silent, dark shape in the pasture. As darkness fell completely, John was still on the porch, the foreclosure notice crumpled in his fist. Javier approached, no longer the slick buyer, but a strategist. "Mr. Thorne is arrogant," Javier stated simply. "His pride is his weakness. He believes his horses are superior because he paid millions for them. He believes you are a failure because you are poor. He cannot imagine a world where he could lose to you." John said nothing, his mind a storm of panic and rage. "He wants your horse," Javier continued. "But more than that, he wants to humiliate you. He wants to prove that his money is more powerful than your whatever it is you have. Your grit, your sentimentality." Javier paused. "So, we will use that. We will propose a wager. A race." John finally looked at him. "A race?" "Yes. One race. Tomorrow afternoon, before the sunset deadline. Your miracle against his champion. We will make it a public event. We will invite the local press. We will frame it as the ultimate test. The homegrown underdog against the multi-million-dollar champion." Javier's voice was electric with possibility. "The stakes are simple. If Miracle wins, my consortium pays off your entire debt to Mr. Thorne. The ranch is yours, free and clear. Mr. Thorne walks away with nothing but public humiliation. If you lose, Mr. Thorne gets the ranch, and my consortium buys the horse from him at his new price. My clients get their horse either way. You, however, get one chance. A fighting chance. Instead of losing everything on paper, you lose it on your feet." It was a crazy, desperate, high-wire act. A long shot. But it was better than the slow, certain death of the foreclosure. John looked out toward the paddock where Miracle stood as a dark silhouette under the moon. He thought of the tiny, dying foal. He had taken a 1 in 100 chance then. What was one more? "He'll never agree," John said, his voice rough. "His pride won't let him refuse," Javier countered. "Not if we make the challenge public." The next morning, the valley was buzzing. Javier Morales had been busy. He'd made 2 calls. The first was to the local newspaper. The second was directly to Marcus Thorne's office. He'd laid out the challenge, framing it as a gentleman's wager to settle the matter of the Gallatin Valley's true champion. Just as Javier predicted, Thorne's ego couldn't resist. The idea of publicly crushing John Callahan and his charity case horse was too delicious to pass up. He agreed immediately, his voice booming with confidence over the phone. The news spread like wildfire. By midday, trucks and cars began lining the county road that ran alongside John's property. An impromptu racetrack was marked out. A 1-mile straightaway along the flattest part of the valley floor, starting at an old oak tree and finishing at John's front gate. The finish line. One way or another, his life would end or begin again right there. Dr. Evelyn Reed's truck pulled up around 2 o'clock. She got out, her face a mixture of worry and awe. "John, I heard. Are you insane?" she asked, but there was a smile in her eyes. She looked over at Miracle, who was being saddled by a silent, focused John. The horse seemed to sense the tension, his muscles twitching, his eyes bright. "He looks magnificent," she said softly. "I still don't know how you did it." "I didn't," John said, tightening the cinch. "He did." He ran a hand down Miracle's powerful neck, whispering something only the horse could hear. Marcus Thorne arrived in grand style, his prize horse. A massive black stallion named Black Onyx, transported in a climate-controlled trailer. Black Onyx was the product of impeccable European bloodlines, a perfectly engineered racing machine. He was pure power and muscle, and he radiated an aggressive energy. Thorne, dressed in expensive riding gear, looked every bit the corporate champion. He surveyed the ragtag crowd of local ranchers and farmers with disdain. The sheriff was there, not as law enforcement, but as the official witness to the wager. The sun began its slow descent towards the mountains, painting the sky in fiery colors. It was time. John, in his worn jeans and boots, walked Miracle to the starting line at the old oak tree. He would ride him himself. He wasn't a jockey, but no one on earth knew this horse better. Thorne was mounted on Black Onyx, a professional jockey beside him looking nervous. Thorne chose to ride himself, his arrogance demanding he be the one to deliver the final blow. The 2 horses stood side by side. They were a study in contrasts. The brute force of Black Onyx versus the fluid grace of Miracle. The manufactured champion versus the horse that had refused to die. The crowd fell silent. The sheriff stood between them, a red bandana in his hand. "The rules are simple," he announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "First horse to the gate wins. The wager is legally binding. Are you both ready?" Thorne nodded curtly, gathering his reins. John leaned forward, his face close to Miracle's ear. He didn't speak. He just breathed with the horse, their heartbeats seeming to fall into the same rhythm. The sheriff raised the bandana. For a heartbeat, everything was frozen. The crowd, the horses, the 2 men, the setting sun. Then the bandana fell. Black Onyx exploded from the start. Thorne dug his heels in, and the stallion launched forward like a cannonball, churning up the earth. He gained a full length on Miracle in the first few seconds. The raw power was shocking. Thorne let out a triumphant yell, already tasting victory. Miracle started slower, more fluidly. John didn't panic. He trusted the horse. He let Miracle find his stride, his movements effortless and smooth, a golden ribbon stretching across the dry grass. The crowd watched as Black Onyx, the dark powerhouse, led the golden horse by 2 lengths, then 3. Thorne was riding with aggression, whipping his horse, demanding more speed. John rode quietly, his body moving in perfect sync with Miracle, becoming one with the animal beneath him. They passed the halfway point. Black Onyx was still ahead, but Miracle was holding the distance, not letting it grow. Thorne glanced over his shoulder, a flash of irritation on his face. This was supposed to be an execution, not a race. He pushed his stallion harder. The massive horse was beginning to breathe heavily, his powerful strides losing their initial explosive force. Miracle, however, ran with a serene and relentless rhythm. His breathing was deep and even. He was closing the gap. Slowly, inexorably, an inch at a time. The crowd began to murmur, then to shout. They were witnessing the impossible. With a quarter-mile left to go, they were neck and neck. The brute force of black onyx against the stunning stamina of Miracle. Thorne's face was a mask of fury. He could feel his horse tiring. He saw John's calm, determined face, and his rage boiled over. He steered Black Onyx slightly, trying to cut Miracle off, to intimidate him. Miracle didn't flinch. He just ran. They were thundering towards the finish line at John's gate. The noise of the hooves was a deafening drumbeat. The crowd was a single, roaring voice. They were side by side, two forces of nature locked in a final, desperate struggle. It looked like neither horse could gain an advantage. They were a blur of black and gold. Just as it seemed they would cross the line together, John did something. He leaned forward and shouted a single sharp word. Home! It was the word he had used every day for 2 years, the word that meant the laundry room, the warm blankets, the safety from the storm. It was the word that meant survival. A new gear engaged in Miracle. It wasn't from his muscles, it was from his heart. He stretched his neck, his golden nose pushing forward, his legs a final, impossible blur. He crossed the line. He won by the length of his head. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by an eruption of cheers that shook the valley. John pulled Miracle to a gentle stop, sliding from his back. He buried his face in the horse's sweaty neck, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Marcus Thorne sat frozen on his heaving, defeated stallion, his face pale with disbelief and utter humiliation. The crowd swarmed John and Miracle, clapping John on the back, touching the horse in awe. Javier Morales appeared through the crowd, a wide, satisfied grin on his face. He caught the sheriff's eye. The sheriff, smiling broadly, took the crumpled foreclosure notice from his pocket and slowly, deliberately, tore it into tiny pieces, letting them fall to the dust. Later, as the last of the trucks pulled away and twilight settled over the ranch, John stood on his porch. The air was cool and clean. The ranch was his. Truly his. Javier Morales approached him one last time. "My clients are ecstatic," he said. "They love a winner more than anything. The offer of $7 million still stands, Mr. Callahan. In fact, it is now $10 million. For you, whenever you want it. No pressure." John looked out at the pasture. Miracle was grazing peacefully, the setting sun catching the gold in his coat. He was no longer just a horse. He was the guardian of this land, the living symbol of a promise kept. John looked at Javier and smiled, a real smile, for the first time in years. "He's home," John said. "He's not for sale." He had everything he needed. He had won more than a race. He had won his life back. Was John right to risk everything he owned on a single race? Or should he have just taken the initial offer and secured his future?